Well, welcome. My name is Hilda McClure. We are talking about the cultural genogram and how we can use it to help build cultural sensitivity and cultural intelligence. And we start that by understanding our own culture. So just before we dive in a little bit about me, I grew up in Puerto Rico and I moved to Texas to go to undergrad, and I've been here ever since. I did my undergraduate in education and then my graduate degree in counseling here in DFW. I am married and we don't have any kiddos, but we do have a little dog, Kia, who's like our firstborn, basically the millennials that are ruining the baby industry. That's kind of what I fall into. And so I'm joined today by the lovely Dr. Leti, who I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Leti Cavazos, and I am the founder and CEO of Conenta Center here in DFW. And we also have a location in San Antonio, Texas. And a little bit about me. So I am married and I have two kiddos, but they are not represented here. We have my little grandbaby who kind of trumped my kiddos, and we have another one on the way. And this is my husband and my dog. And I received my master's of social work from the University of Texas in San Antonio and my doctorate in social work from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I am of Mexican heritage. And so a lot of my perspective comes from that lens. And so when we start talking about culture, we'll talk about how everybody kind of has a different lens based on their family background. So a little bit about Conenta Center, just so you have an idea of who we are and what gives us the authority to have this conversation is, so Conenta Center for Healing and Empowerment was created in 2021 after kind of a reflection of the needs that were needed in the community. And we identified that there was a gap in services for the Hispanic community, removing barriers of language and culture. And we picked Conenta because Conenta is Latin for woman who possesses healing powers. So the abbreviated way to say that is a healer. And so we thought that was the perfect name for us. And so we started Conenta Center in 2021. In 2022, we started Conenta Foundation, and could be because mainly because we saw a huge population of people coming forward wanting healing, but they were undocumented, uninsured, didn't have the financial means to pay for counseling. And so we wanted to remove the financial barrier to healing. And my motto is that healing should never be a luxury. And so how do we make healing accessible to the community that is seeking it? And so that's who we are, and that's how we got here today.
And what Dr. Leti didn't mention is we just hosted the first Hispanic mental health conference here in Dallas. And so we had our comunidad of either Hispanic or Latinx healers with us all together. And it was a really unique opportunity for the Dallas-Fort Worth area to bring everyone together.
So our objectives today, I'm really excited about this because we're really going to dive into culture and how that influences how we work with individuals. And so we're going to learn the importance and the usefulness of using a cultural genogram as a tool. I think in school we all learn how to do a genogram. So we're going to kind of take it a step further and look at the cultural genogram. And so how do we use it as a tool for cultural sensitivity and connecting with cultural wealth? And what does that mean when we say cultural wealth? And then learning the process of creating a cultural genogram by kind of introducing the symbols. It's going to be kind of a review for those of you who already learned it, but then also creating your own genogram, because it's so important that you understand your own culture and what's been passed down so that you have the self-awareness and you're more able to be connected and understanding and empathetic to the clients when they're going through theirs.
So we're going to just start with culture. And maybe you're already familiar with this term or have a good understanding of culture, but we're just going to do a quick review. So basically, when we talk about culture, there's a lot of different defining definitions of what that means. And from researcher to researcher, they define it differently. And so for the purposes of today, we're going to use Edward T. Hall's model, which he talks a lot about it being like an iceberg. And so culture is 10% of what we see and what we would typically consider culture, which is maybe the way we dress or the food we eat, things that are really easily observed. So as we move into October, right, talking about Dia de los Muertos and right, the festivals and the gatherings. So that would fall on the 10% of culture, that top part of the iceberg. But really, the heart of culture is actually the 90% that we don't see. And so this is where we talk about core values or belief systems, perceptions, biases, assumptions. All of that is culture. And so I think sometimes we can very easily fall into that if we are just a standard, I'm going to use quotation marks around this, like a standard American family, that we don't have culture, but that's not actually true. The research has shown that family systems inherently are multicultural systems because we start to talk about possibly gender differences or generational differences. And so each of those things have their own culture to go with that. Another way to look at culture, and I really love the culture wheel because it can give us some really firm examples. So I'll go through this really briefly. So knowledge and stories. So thinking through about how we pass on culture, a lot of times it's through stories, right? We think of La Llorona or La Chupacabra, and every culture has stories that kind of get passed down. We also have language, right? So when we talk about language is a huge part of it, whether we speak a different language or we don't, right? So even within the Latinx community, we think through like those who do speak Spanish, those who don't speak Spanish. And if they do speak Spanish, there's different dialects, right? Like not all Spanish is the same. And then in more recent times, I remember being in school and there being a very big pushback against Spanglish, but now that is becoming more widely acceptable. And also the research is showing, if anyone does bilingual education, that Spanglish actually engages different parts of the brain compared to only speaking one language at a time. So that's pretty interesting. And so that is a big part. And so when we talk about mental health or anything like that, we can only express ourselves to the extent of our language in either of those languages, right? So when we talk about clients in the counseling room, I don't necessarily think that you always have to have someone who speaks all the languages you speak, but it could be helpful because we can only express to the extent that we understand it in one of the languages. So that's a huge part of culture, thinking about traditions and rituals. So for example, for my family, we always had a Three Kings Day get together with my family. And the night before, we always set grass at the end of our bed for the camels. And so that kind of falls into that. Techniques and skills. So when we think about maybe curanderismo or right, like there are specific skills or techniques that we'll use that are specific to our culture. And with that, we can also include tools and objects. So thinking through the vaporu, right? We put vaporu on everything. Or if we think about the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where they use the Windex for everything. So those are cultural tools and objects. The arts, right? So we think about music and paintings and sculpture or even like graffiti, like all of those things kind of fall into the arts and influence culture. Food and drink, that's like a big one. This is the one that we often assume is culture, if we, but that's honestly just a really small part of culture. And then our values. So we're thinking through Hispanic or Latinx core values. We think about familismo. We think a little bit maybe even about machismo, marianismo, confianza, right? Those are all core values for our culture. And then lastly, greater community. And so thinking through how we gather, right? So I remember growing up and my tias and my tios having a whole conversation about how no matter what happens in our family, so whether someone graduates or someone has a baby or someone doesn't graduate, we always get together to have a celebration about it, because that was important to our community, is that we're inviting people into the fold. And so those are some of the elements that encompass culture. I think another important part of what we need to think about is that culture doesn't live in a vacuum, right? And especially in the US. So I want to give us a couple of words to define how cultures interact. And I'm going to show you the assimilation / acculturation model that is pretty well known or used, but I'm going to do a quick review. So we talk about assimilation, and this is how cultures become alike. So this is thinking about maybe the immigrant who has been told, whether at job interviews or just in the culture in general, that they have to speak English perfectly and they have to dress a certain way. And so that's what they do. They're right. There's that leaving of their culture of origin and moving towards sameness. This process can be fast and steady, and it can be but it can also be really impulsive, and it can be involuntary, right? So sometimes assimilation is a little sneakier than just, hey, I'm making this choice today. We'll also see a complete abandonment of that original culture. In contrast to that, we have acculturation. And so this is how we merge or create a cultural fusion between cultures. Okay, so another way to think about this is you have a partner or you get married and you decide together, right? You have very different upbringings, but you decide together to pick and choose what parts of your own individual culture you're going to bring into the relationship, and how are you going to practice those things. The key here is that neither culture is threatened or eliminated, right? So there is enough space to be held for both of those cultures, or 3 cultures or 4 cultures, right? Thinking about multicultural systems. And so I think the first ways that these start to show up is often in clothing or food habits or language, but it can also be in core values and belief systems as well. And then lastly, there's the word enculturate, which is really the process of learning our own culture. And so we begin to enculturate from birth. So the minute we are born, we are starting this enculturation process. We are watching what our parents are doing. We are watching what our family members are doing. And then we choose to engage in those things. Sometimes, right, we don't necessarily actively choose because we don't know anything different, but it's always happening. You start a new job, you begin to enculturate for that space. You get married, you enter into a relationship, you begin to enculturate. You have a child, right? You become a parent for the first time. You're now determined. Now you are enculturating. The beautiful part of enculturation is there is active choice. So while assimilation and enculturation talks a lot more about how cultures interact together, enculturation is about the active choice of how to express culture. Okay, so some of it does happen without, like, subconsciously, right? And then other parts of enculturation can happen actively and by choice, right? So we can decide how we are going to engage with certain parts of our culture, or even the adoption of other culture. So thinking through I'm trying to think of an example in my own life, but after I got married, the way my husband's family did a few things, I decided, like, oh, I'm going to do it that way too, because that is something that I think lines up with my core values. And so, right, so that can be an active part of enculturation as well. So we're just really briefly, this might make more sense. This is Barry. Barry does a lot of work around culture too, really good research. But this is the model he uses, right? So if we accept host culture and reject home culture, there's that assimilation. Notice the little figure becomes blue like the other ones. If we have reject host culture and reject home culture, we have marginalization, right? So just notice that the person becomes solitary. On the other side, we accept host culture and retain home culture. This is what we call acculturation or integration. So notice that the figure doesn't change color, but they're in community. Okay. And then lastly, if we reject host culture or retain home culture, we have separation. So there is no change and there is no community. So that's going to roll us right into the to genogram and cultural genogram.
All right, so we're going to look at what is a genogram. And like many of you know, it's kind of a model of a family tree. And so we look at relationships, we look at marriages, mental health patterns. We really want to look at things that are passed down. What are some significant key points in multi-generational kind of a bird's eye view? And so the best genograms are typically 3 generations because that's a good way to kind of look at patterns. Typically, there's symbols that represent certain things, and we'll go over some of those just for review. And there's some that don't have symbols, and so you get to make those up. And so that's always the fun part when you're doing that with clients is what do you want to represent this? And so the genogram in whole is a good way to kind of look at patterns so that not only for you, but for the client to really understand what's been passed down. What is it that is a pattern in the family that maybe they hadn't realized?
And genograms are fairly flexible in the sense that you can use a genogram for anything. So if you're wanting to track, today we're talking about cultural genograms, but you can do spiritual genograms, you can do medical genograms, you can do like relational genograms, and we'll show some examples here in a second. So when we look at this genogram, we see that looks like the center participants might be Andre. And so when we look at this, we can see that he was married twice. So he has his first marriage, and then he was married again in 83. Looks like Helene died in 81. So that might have been what ended the first marriage. Then underneath, you see all of his kiddos. Okay, year of birth. And then another kiddo from the second marriage. And then these other colored symbols, they all have meaning in terms of relationship.
So now we're looking at how do we incorporate culture into that genogram. And so culture, the cultural genogram adds the cultural heritage and patterns. So you can use colors to distinguish different heritages or ethnicities. You can also look at immigration, cultural values, religion, practices, all kinds of things that have to do with culture. And if you look at this one, there's kind of a mixture of different ethnicities that they've highlighted and identified and how it's been passed down. So I know that there's a big push with people doing 23andMe and trying to figure out their lineage, but this is a really good way to kind of look at, you know, when people came to this country, like what generation was it? What were the beliefs? What were the things that they held on to a lot of times for survival, and what was passed down? Because a lot of times we do things we don't even know why we do it, and we find out it's our parents did it because our grandparents did it. And this is a good way to kind of identify where are those traditions coming from? Where are those beliefs coming from? Where are those rituals coming from that, you know, we do without even thinking about it? And when we're able to do that with our clients, it gives us a better understanding of where they're coming from. You know, everybody, I think, talks about cultural competency, but what we've learned is that it's more cultural humility, because we can't know about every culture, and every culture is different, even if they're Hispanic to Hispanic or Latinx, or it everybody's different. So this is a good way to sit and really understand your client that's in front of you. What was their journey? What's their experience? What was their family's experience? So that you're really getting a good understanding of who's sitting in front of you.
And so these are some of the basic symbols that we typically use from genogram to genogram, despite what kind of genogram. And right, depending on what what type of genogram you know, some of these you might skip, but just a kind of a general, when we talk about, they don't have a non-binary symbol yet, but that is something that you can very easily create, right? There's a little bit of flexibility in that to add some in symbols as needed, right? But so different marriages, and then they kind of show an example. And so we always start with you. And so we typically start with this little, I don't know what to call it, but the little two people here, this little bar in the middle. And then here are some of the other ones we'll use to determine relationship. Okay, so just a general is going to be that straight line between people, and then these, you can add these as extra to determine relationship. Okay.
I think one of the things I want to add is like these are typical symbols that we use, and it's when you're doing a cultural genogram with your clients, to just be very mindful, because a lot of times, especially with abuse or estrangement or anything that is unspoken, it will bring up things. And so keeping in mind that typically, I'm not saying always, typically in the Hispanic culture, you don't talk about these things outside your family. And so when we're putting it down, it makes it more real. It makes it kind of come to life. And then seeing the pattern, sometimes it's like, oh, wow, this, I knew that happened to my tia, but I didn't know that like once I see it down on paper, how prevalent it was in our family. And so just keeping in mind what that's going to impact for your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So now it's actually our turn. So we're just going to ask you to take out a piece of paper, a notebook, wherever you take notes, and we're going to walk through and ask for a couple people to share in the chat. In the chat. And so we're going to walk you through how to build your own cultural genogram, because part of the work, right, is that we can absolutely walk our clients through this, but sometimes we are unaware of our own. If we go back to that, if we go back to this, oh, my computer's being silly. There it is. When we go back to this iceberg, sometimes we ourselves are not aware about some of this bottom parts, the core values, the attitudes, beliefs, etc. And sometimes in my own story is that I never had language for some of this. So I couldn't talk about Marianismo or how that impacts me because I didn't have language for it. And so our goal today is that you will leave not only knowing how to do a cultural genogram with your clients, but you'll find have of understanding of. So we're gonna kind of walk through it. And so for those of you who are brave and shares, we're gonna just ask you to pop some of the answers in the chat if you're willing to share. And Dr. Leti and I will share as well. That goes with it. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to identify your culture of origin. Okay, and so that is going to be, it can be ethnicity, it can be nationality, but it's going back in time, even beyond, unless you have Native American ancestry, like even beyond the U.S. So, for example, my dad is Puerto Rican. Part of that is I think he has more African like descendants because of the color of his skin and color of my grandmother's skin. So I could put that down. For my mom's from New Jersey, and so she is German. My grandfather's German and my grandmother is Hungarian. Right, and so this is why we would go up 3 generations. On my dad's side, I don't have, beyond my grandmother and my grandfather, we actually don't know, because my grandmother's parents died when she was 6. So we don't actually know above her. And she didn't really know. We do know that she carried the name Yearwood, which for her indicated that she might have Spaniard blood, but my assumption is probably was the slave owner's name that went with that. On my mother's side, I don't know beyond my grandparents. My mom does, but I don't. And then that becomes an issue of how we ask family members for more information. So Letty, do you want to share a little bit about yours?
Oh, so I think in my family history, my grandparents came from Mexico, and it's easy to say that's where it ends, but it doesn't. So going back and looking at just kind of the genealogy, the DNA testing, there's a lot of Portuguese, Spanish from Spain in our bloodline, and honestly, we don't know where that comes from because as far as we knew, we were from Mexico, and my grandfather came when he was very young on both sides, and my grandmother came with her sister and left the rest of her family behind. And so we had very limited knowledge of the family that was left in Mexico.
So if we have a couple brave souls that would be willing to drop in the chat some of your cultures of origin, some of the ones, maybe some of the ones, places you have question marks. So we'll just wait. And as I see them come through, I'll read them out. We're really good at waiting, just FYI. No one? No sharers today? Okay, here we go. Here we go. So Ana Marie shared that I'm already stuck because Texas and family was here before there was a Texas. So that's actually great information to know, right? Sicilian, and some from Northern Italy for Brooks. For Gina, we have French, Spanish, Israeli, Mexican. Marissa, as far as I know, Italian, Irish, German, Austrian, and English. Let's see. Andrea, I'm sorry if I say your name. Sephardic Jews living in Turkey as part of the Spanish diaspora. Yeah, that's great. Mom is Mexican with origins in Zacatecas on both sides. And then dad is Mexican with origins in Puebla and Veracruz. And so just to add to there, right, like even if you know different regions, right, like different regions have different cultures. And so if it's beneficial to you, you could actually separate those out. So not just necessarily Mexican, but you could do like Veracruz and Zacatecas if you know there are cultural differences between those regions. Maternal side, Taino Indian, Puerto Rican, paternal side, Puerto Rican with great grandmother were Russian, Romanian, migrated Jews. French Italian on one side, Native on the other, Mexican and Spanish. Mexican American culturally. My mother's family is a mix of Spanish, some Indigenous heritage, as well as Middle Eastern, Eastern Europe, and North Africa. And then on my father's side, their heritage comes mostly from Ireland, with some England and German. Oh, I love all the answers. Roberto, Mexican, Tamaulipas. I'm sorry mispronouncing. And then Mexican American from Texas, and then Texas Indian and Spanish. Canadian with previous generations from various West Euro countries and some Indigenous. One side of the family was very rooted in Canadian East Coast maritime culture versus the other side were farmers on the Canadian prairie. So excellent. That's a prime example of you culturally being or nationally being from the same country, but culturally being from different regions, which might be important to note on a cultural genogram. And then here, this is going to be our last one. Melissa mentioned maternal was born in Mexico, but has native ties that we don't know. And then paternal side was from America, but his mother was born in the Philippines, and his father's side is a melting pot of Caucasian with mostly Irish. Great. Excellent. Okay, so make a list of those because you're going to need those. Now what we're going to do, this part is a little trickier, and so I'm going to do my best to kind of walk us through this. We're going to organize what the creator of the cultural genogram labels as organizing principles, and then pride and shame issues, okay? Because these are the things that we're going to begin to track to better understand culture, okay? So organizing principles tend to be value neutral. So for example, in Hispanic or Latinx culture, we might call this familismo, right? So this idea that we value family. We could also put on here confianza. We could put on here, Letty, help me out, I'm just blanking. Elements of Marianismo. We could put, that's an organizing principle. It tends to be value neutral. Now, under those issues, under those behaviors or those organizing principles, we have pride and shame issues. So these are going to be cultural behaviors that the culture either views negatively or positively. So to give an example of this, familismo is the organizing principle, but however, under that, talking to strangers about mental health issues is a shame issue. Okay. Always respecting your elders by never speaking rudely to them. So thinking about your abuelas or your abuelo, your parents, that's a pride issue, right? But that respeto, that's the organizing principle. Okay. And these pride issues, and we can talk about this here in a second, is pride issues can be considered cultural wealth. So if you're familiar with the community cultural wealth model, comes from Yoso. It comes a little bit out of critical race theory, but basically it's a model that we use for first generation college students, and it helps them identify what in their culture is can be considered wealth. So it might be aspirational, meaning that they feel a lot of hope for the future to do something. Maybe their mom is a teacher and they feel inspired to become a teacher. And so that's what moves them forward. It could be a language is part of cultural wealth. Letty, do you remember the other ones?
Not off the top of my head, but I think that what I wanted to point out is it did start with college students, but it's been translated into other arenas. And so really looking at the things that we have innately through our culture and how that benefits us. And we see that as well. So, you mentioned language, and language, the fact that you know multiple languages is an asset that not everybody has. And to be able to see that, community is, the sense of community is an asset that not everybody has. And the importance that we put on that, with the Hispanic community, we're relational. And so we have tias and tios that maybe aren't blood related, but we have that culture. We have those people that support us and have our back. And that is a wealth that not everybody has, but we have been able to establish that through our culture. Even being able to navigate discrimination and racism is cultural wealth, because we've learned how to manage and advocate in a way that others that haven't experienced that haven't had the opportunity to build that skill.
Yeah. So an example of some organizing principles for my family would be this idea of resilience or perseverance. On my mom's side, they really enjoy knowledge. So knowledge, education it would be an organizing principle on that side. It takes a little bit of work to kind of think through some of this, because some of this is kind of where that cultural sensitivity or cultural humility comes into play. because it actually requires us to think about the mechanisms that are impacting our family units, or even the biases that are internal. So when we pride and shame issues, family, some shame issues are, these are probably typically easier to name, right? But some of the shame issues are quitting. So my family really does not, like we didn't get to quit things growing up, because there was a lot of shame around that. Like even when, so I moved to Texas when I was 18 by myself, and that first semester was incredibly difficult in a very different culture. I didn't have a vehicle. I went to my university was in Dallas, but it wasn't like in downtown Dallas. It was a closed campus, and so it was really difficult. And so I went home that December, and I thought that I was like going to try to convince my dad to move me back so that I could start in Puerto Rico in that January. And I mean, I literally waited to the last minute, because I really felt like, because my dad missed me, he would let me come back. But the conversation we actually had was that I wasn't allowed to quit until I finished the year. And that was what the conversation became about. It was like, you just don't get to quit just because this is hard for you. So that would definitely fall into a shame issue. On my mom's side, so talking about pride issues is, all of my cousins and I all have degrees, and that is a huge pride issue for them. So there's a lot of expectation for us to go to college and get maybe even several degrees. Another pride issue that I see on my dad's side is a lot of togetherness. So we actively choose to be together on weekends. And so, I mean, I could maybe label that like just intentional family time. Could be a pride issue, a shame issue. On my dad's side is we have to stick to the norm. So any of my family members that decide to do it differently than it's always been done, we typically get a little ostracized. And so I fall into that, because I moved to Texas and I never moved back home to Puerto Rico, and I got married. And so that is a kind of a shame issue. And so I have a couple cousins who kind of similarly, they moved to the East Coast, and there's a lot of conversations, or not pleasant conversations, around that. Did you have any examples from your life?
I think that like you said, shame is the easier one to identify. So I think in my life, I was a teen mom. And so although some people would say that's pretty typical, it was still a source of shame for my family to say that I was having a child and I was a teenager. And then I got divorced early, and which was another source of shame. And so I think that those things, when you look at the family dynamics, you're looking at the genogram, you can kind of see patterns also. In my life, there was domestic violence. And then when I go back and look at history, there's a pattern of that I hadn't realized. And I thought that I was alone in that, because there's so much shame in talking about that or admitting that that's in our family.
Absolutely. And there's a question here, is differentiation frowned upon? Sometimes it is. So for my family, my dad's side, so my mom moved from New Jersey to Puerto Rico. She worked there and they lived there. So my home in essence was bicultural, because I had Puerto Rican, there's like a lot of Puerto Rican culture, but there was also a lot of American culture. My mom was strong and stubborn, and that's where I typically get it from. And so she was okay with differentiation. She herself was right what differentiated from her family. Everyone else stayed in New Jersey. But on my dad's side, to put it, I think this is an easy. One of my tias has always lived in the same house, and she is now in her 60s. She always lived with her grandmother. And now what's so interesting to me, that almost every single one of my grandmother, like my tias and tios, are now back in that same house. So whether they got divorced or whatnot, I have one Theo that lived there until like 2 years ago, and he's older than my dad. My dad's almost 70. And so he just moved out, but he had been with the same, just got married and he's been with the same woman since I was like 10, so like 20 years. And so, yeah, no. So differentiation was it's highly, highly frowned upon in family. And so so get this, so I decided to move to Texas, there was a family meeting with my tias, with my dad to talk about that decision and how could he let me go do that, and like that is not what we do. And so, and then that got back to me because then I got pulled into this family meeting, and my dad is pretty great about like creating boundaries and was like, that is just not a topic of conversation, but that's what we did. And so,
I think,
go ahead.
can I just say, like with differentiation though, it may be frowned upon, but it's something that we want to look at because we're looking at generational trauma too. And so when you are the first one to step outside of the generational trauma and try to make different decisions to heal yourself and heal future generations, it's going to look different and people are going to react to that. And so being able to hold that space for your clients to say, yes, what you're doing is different, but it's also a healing process for not just you, but everybody that's coming after you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Rosie. Rosie mentioned that she's the first to openly admit to therapy. Yeah, and really that's what it becomes. Differentiation can be frowned upon, but not always, but a lot of times when we look at this cultural genogram, we're actually starting a second genogram of health, right, to fall in line. And what I find so curious often about differentiation is that once you become healthy, people want to be around you. And so even in my own story, my tias are super proud of me now, right? It was a struggle for a long time. Or even on my husband's side, where he's had to do some differentiation because there was a little bit of enmeshment, some boundary issues. When there's an emergency, they don't call dad, they call us, right? I had my sister-in-law sleeping on my couch for a couple of weeks, right? When my father-in-law has a sufficiently big house to accommodate them. But we think part of that is that differentiation for health. Yeah, I love that, Rosie. They all want to seek therapy because health is attractive, right? Like most of us want to be healthy. So if I could, and Anna Mia also shared that they had a similar experience living in the same house for many years. Yeah, it's super interesting. I think there's a little bit of appeal for me to like be with like the family, but there's also, I like my personal space. If we could have a couple more people that would be willing to share maybe either some organizing principles for their culture or some pride shame issues, I think that could be helpful to give language to others that might know that there's something there, but don't have language for it. Okay. So someone mentioned a distinct shame issue around queerness. Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So that could be bias or discrimination, right? Or even like shame, the emotion itself around queerness. Mm-hmm. An organizing principle, modesty. Yep, that's a good one. Therapy was a shame. Mm-hmm. Yep. If you were crazy, you were sought out therapy, and you sought out therapy, you were considered weak. Yep. And it's alive. That stuff is still alive and well. Mm-hmm. I see that in my therapy room. Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, so would this fall under organizing principles, women in our family not needing men? Took me a long time. Yeah, so that would be an organizing principle that we could maybe do like independence, right? That's a little bit more value neutral. And then the shame issue could be depending on man's money or depending on men's emotional or like emotionally. Mm-hmm.
I want to just look at that a little deeper too, because I've seen that in the counseling room, because it's not that um women don't need men, but historically in the family, men haven't been dependable. And so they've had to become independent. And so when that's the pattern and belief system in the family, the pattern repeats itself until you heal and are able to identify what is drawing you to those men that aren't capable of giving you what you need in that relationship, and trying to seek out healthy relationships. And so that's a pattern that kind of falls in systems. One of my clients, she realized that everybody in her family until her was a single mom. And when she was able to step back and look at that, like, where were the men in all of these relationships and all these families? And she realized, like, I need to step out and do something different. I need to pay attention to the relationships I'm getting into. And what are my expectations in a relationship?
Yeah, so good. Giancarlo asked, would religious aspects of one's family be an organizing principle? Absolutely. So the organizing principle could be the religion, and then under that, you could have shame and pride issues that are behaviors. We had, you never told anything that went on in the household, or you were the bad person. Yep. That concept crosses over so much. Absolutely. How do you identify it on the genogram if it is both and? Boundaries to not get hurt outside of the family, but setting boundaries inside the family is negative. So we're gonna get into like the kind of the nitty gritty here in a second. So if those are two different issues, we're actually going to create symbols. So now that we're going to move a little quicker because we only have like 10 to 12 minutes. But so talking about the home dynamic. Yeah. So basically, we're going to list all of these things, all the shame issues, all the pride issues. The organizing principles kind of just give us a bucket to what to think about it, because the principle in of itself should be value neutral, right? Like religion, value neutral. When we get into the heart of religion, the pride and shame issues, those are where the behaviors, we start to see patterns and behaviors. So now what I want you to do is I want you to create symbols for the pride and shame issues. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be consistent throughout the genogram. So maybe for the boundaries, you might want to put a little triangle, or you might want to put, right. So you might put a little triangle with an X in it when we don't put boundaries on inside the family. Okay. So just a couple, and maybe if you guys want to drop in the chat a couple of ideas for symbols. So los hombres no lloran, men don't cry, right? So a good symbol for that might be a little sad emoji with an X on it, or the X on the eyes with little tears underneath it. I can get real creative. This is the fun part. Some more shame. I just want to make sure I recognize these. Talking about home dynamic was a no-no. Yep. Shame, sickness in the family, not made public. Absolutely. Los hombres no lloran. So go ahead and just, yeah. And that's also the case in the African-American community. Yeah. When we go out and talk about, like, we do a different presentation about some of the actual cultural values in Hispanic community, we find that there's a lot of overlap with the African-American community. Mm-hmm. For pride, men who have a lot of offspring. So symbol could be stick figure with the word legacy. Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Yep. This part is fairly flexible. Los trapos sucios se lavan en casa. Yeah. Yeah. Really sharing the half of her neighborhood is Black and Latino. Mm-hmm. Half and half. Yep. So after you have the symbols, you're actually going to select the colors for the different cultures. So if you have Mexican, Puerto Rican, Dominican, all three of those would get a different color. So again, just list it, put the color next to it, right? You're creating a legend of sorts, like on a map, so that you know what everything means. And so if we go back to the cultural genogram, which is not a great, which is not a great picture. This is from Frida Kahlo, that's her family. So notice at the top where she has the colors, right? So the red is Mexican, the blue is German, the purple, the dark purple is Hungarian Jewish, so that's purple, a dark purple. There's a lighter purple on the other side where it's Portuguese Jewish. So you're going to give every culture that you can identify a different color. You're also wanting to identify any intercultural marriages. Okay, so I don't know if this one has it. Yeah. No, I don't think that's, this one doesn't really have it, but anytime a new added, that you're just going to want to take note of that. So for example, for my parents' marriage, right? My dad's Puerto Rican, my mom is from New Jersey, that would be an intercultural marriage. And we're going to use this little symbol, the top of the anya is what I call it, to indicate. So now is the fun part. We are going to now build the genogram. And so you're going to start with you. So I put the basic symbols on there. If you identify as non-binary, feel free to create your own symbol. If none of these, if these don't work. Okay. And so you'll start with yourself. And then you're going to start building up. So I'm gonna do my best to draw mine on here. Okay, so it would be me. And then I am married. And that's my husband. If I wanted, I could put married in the year. This is gonna be real ugly, but you guys get the kind of the idea. Okay. And so then you put on the basic structure. Okay. Once you have the basic structure, you're going to start putting the elements that we already talked about, right? So that's why we put that in first, is we add the shame issues and kind of where we know them to be, okay? So I can, for example, this stuff with my dad about never quitting, right? I can put that near my dad. And if you want, you can put the symbol. And if you want, you can also add a note. So if we go back to Frida's, let me clear this. Right, you can see that there's some notes next to it. When they immigrated, right? And you might want to create a symbol for immigration. That's okay. Okay, immigration, right? They put some notes about suicide. They put some, sometimes the profession can be important, right? So like in my family, we have like a long line of teachers, right? So that can be important if someone branches out of that. And then as you kind of continue to build up, you can see how the colors start to mix, right? So if you look here at Diego, he has like 7 colors on there. Yes, Gina. So to your point, sometimes it can be interchangeable, right? So not quitting, there can be elements like, hey, you persevered, But there can also be shame elements to like when you quit, right? Like that conversation with my dad still sticks with me about quitting and just like how much like that was like highly frowned upon. And so that became a shame issue. But perseverance can be a pride issue, yeah. Okay, so and then lastly, we're just to reflect, right? This is obviously you're not going to get this all done in 30 minutes, but we're going to just pause and reflect on some of the other things that might contribute to our cultural genogram. So, number one, under what conditions did your family come to the US? And also too, there was someone who mentioned that they've always been in Texas before Texas was Texas, right? You can explore there around what did that look like and what does that mean if they were here before it was Texas, right? What are some of the implications of that? You can ask yourself questions about your family's experience with oppression. Mm-hmm. What significance do race, skin color, and hair color play out in your family? So for me, I'm pretty light complected, but my grandmother is definitely Black, right? And so she was always so excited to have light grandchildren because of my mom. And so we were kind of put on a pedestal as the white passing grandbabies. So how does that kind of play into that? What role does religion play into your family? You might have some pride issues that come up with that. What are some of the gender roles defined in your family? Pelo malo for curly hair. Yes, yes. We used to talk about that all the time in high school. And I was like, I didn't even realize what that was, you know, when you're 16, or just what's attributed to that. How does your family view people in the LGBTQ IA community? Right. So what are some biases maybe against that? What prejudice or stereotypes does your family have about your own racial group and other racial groups? So something that's pretty interesting about Puerto Ricans is that we have a we discriminate pretty harshly against Mexicans, which was, I never understood that growing up. Yeah, the effects of colorism. Just fact that the Dominican Republic still makes people identify their color on their driver's license, which, so you can be mestizo or mulatto, terms we don't really use anymore, but they'll do that. Principles shaped your family's values about education, work, and interaction with people outside of the family. And so what are the pride and shame issues of your family? We've kind of talked about that, but you know, sometimes even going into like further depth about where the patterns are. Here's the kicker. What impact do you think these pride/shame issues will have on your work clients who are culturally similar and dissimilar? And so using that same answer, how do you think the values you got from your family of origin will influence your ability to work with those who are different than yours, right? When we have that knee-jerk reaction to something, thinking of like maybe even like domestic violence, where you're like, well, she just should just leave. But when we look back, right, because that is kind of your own patterns, your own pride or shame issues, but right, and culturally, it might not be that easy, right? It's even just beyond like resources. It might even be cultural about what it looks like to be a good wife. A few more thoughts here. Spike Lee did a movie on colorism. They're prevalent community. Yeah.
Can I
discrimination.
say a few things before we run out of time? Because I think we're out of time. Is I just want to say, like, the importance of this is that a lot of times families ignored in individual therapy when you go to therapy, and genograms are a great way to help your client feel rooted in their culture and understand how that influences their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors in their everyday life, whether they realize it or not. And so this is a great way to bring that, not only understanding why you think the way you do, you behave the way you do, but also instill some pride also of where they come from and who they are genetically.
Yeah, so good. So good. So we don't really have a time for Q&A today, but thank you so much for participating. And hopefully this can be a really good tool for you to take home to do for your own work, but also with your clients. Here is, oh, Jocelyn, that's a good, I'm going to just add this real, just not reflecting on generational trauma, but generational resiliency, right? And that's where those pride issues come, what people generations did to help us start breaking cycles. Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you again so much. Here you can scan this for our contact information, and our file. And then I'm going to put here in a second. Here's our social media that you guys can follow us on. Go to our website, conentacenter.com, if you'll ever need anything or to reach out. We're more than welcome to answer questions beyond this presentation. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm glad we had a chance to be here with you. I wish I could see all of you. I'd love to have this conversation out loud, but this is great that we had an opportunity to be here with you. So please reach out if you need anything. We're always here to answer questions, and we have also other trainings, and we would love for you to be a part of.